Hello, it's February the 19th. I have to apologize because yesterday I made a video saying it was the 17th and it was really the 18th, which is not a good look if you're an astrologer, if you're getting your days wrong. I was only off by one day though, so it was just maybe the number. I was even talking about the moon, the lunar cycle, right? So I follow the moon closer than the actual days, right? So you can give me give me a break. But what are we doing here? I am exploring. Yesterday I was talking about Deleuze and Deleuzian astrology, which I have to admit may be a kind of a bonkers idea, and I don't think I've gotten really much feedback about it. So I'm kind of like I'm venturing out into the unknown, right? But I was also reading Byung talking about Deleuze, and I got this thing about the idiot, which I already brought up with Dostoyevsky, but that to be a philosopher requires making idiot leaps, basically. Do you have to be willing to, or in the sense of the tarot, you have to be like the fool and be willing to jump off the cliff into something that's kind of silly. And so there's something, there's also, I think, maybe something Uranian about the fool archetype that maybe I'll make a video about at some point in the future. But in that spirit, of being a foolish philosopher and my approach of making a Deleuzian, inventing my own Deleuzian astrology by way of Dane Rudhyar, because I've pieced together Dane Rudhyar as the missing piece of the puzzle, and you can listen to my other videos about this. But I'm going to read some Dane Rudhyar here as a way to interject the Deleuzian schizoanalysis, and also see that maybe Dane Rudhyar is not even that far away from Deleuze in the first place. Maybe Rudhyar kind of is on the same track all along, right? He's just not expressing himself. Well, we'll see how it goes, right? But we're gonna explore Rudhyarian approach to astrology, and here we go. But this is we're gonna go into some sort of critical astrological theory here by way, and this is also kind of old. I have to admit that when was this book originally published in 1936? So you have to admit it's kind of dated at this point. It's almost 100 years old. It's like 90 years old at this point. So scratching my foot. My foot's itchy. Okay. Psychologically speaking, the same. Hold on. This is a part where he's talking about. I have this book from Saint Teresa of Avila called The Interior Castle, which this reminds me of. But there's this basic thing where I was in my astrology channel. You may have noticed I made a bunch of videos about Game of Thrones, and that was partly because I decided to watch Game of Thrones for the first time, and I'm kind of curious about it because I kind of avoided it. And there's something about the whole feudal fantasy, medieval kind of thing, or kind of brutal, that is maybe, I don't know. It was not really my first, but when you're trying to try different things out and seeing what's popular in the popular culture, and also kind of understanding though that what astrology actually came from though was this kind of like, if you were a king or a lord or a noble person, and that it was born out of this system. And so Dane Rudhyar is kind of talking about this, like, with that kind of and also the psychological model that comes with that. And it's kind of interesting because he's kind of comparing it to Freudian Jungian psychology, right? He's saying European ethics and philosophy taught us to build a strong and well-guarded home, or rather a fortified castle, the conscious over which ruled in omnipotence the feudal lord of the ego. The woman who was enslaved by the lord, and the children who cowed into submission. The peasants who toiled around the castle, the instinctual contents of the psyche, were admitted to the castle under strict supervision of an armed guard, and when the enemy menaced the gates, safety locked. Of course, the lovely chapel was built within the fortress, in which an autocratic god camouflaged into compassionate savior was worshipped. the whole picture of the feudal civilization is an exact symbol, as is always the case, of what was happening then within man's psyche. So this idea that this whole having a one principle, the ego, being the supreme ruler that has a kind of a tight control, and that all the forces which are considered forces of the unconscious, this whole thing where you have to have a ball of crystalline light protecting yourself from all the murky depths of the unconscious. It's kind of like having your castle and your castle wall, and that you're not completely shut off by the unconscious, but your conscious ego inspects everything under a close eye that comes in, and you have to fit it into your rational structure. And your feminine side is a woman who's subordinate to you because you're in a patriarchal system, and so it's born out of the actual material circumstance of how society was structured and enslaving everything to the ego and such. And which is interesting is that now in our society, we don't have the same thing where we, unless you have something like, let's say Putin in Russia, where you've got somebody who's in a position where he's very fixed into power and exerting a kind of. But even that, we have this. We don't really see Putin as being the king so much as being somebody who's there, serving the interests of other forces, which we are hidden, obscured by the oligarchy and such like that, right? The Russian oligarchy or whatever. But there's this, and then that kind of politics where people don't really have the same faith in, let's say, a elected leader. There's the appeal to Trumpism or something like that is because we don't trust Hillary Clinton or something like that. We don't trust an Obama because we see them as not really being a sovereign representative, but rather these hidden forces. The conspiracy thing is like the unconscious factor in that situation, right? So the modern political landscape is kind of like this as well. What I'm trying to say is that the modern psychology, we're 90 years after Dane Rudhyar wrote this book, and we're in a bit of a different situation now anyways, right? But it's in a different situation than the feudal lords of the past. But I thought at least that Game of Thrones was interesting, because Game of Thrones kind of makes this thing where it's like, if it's the perfect archetype of the fantasy world of the princess and the king and the fairy tale castle that's all ordered and and nice and stuff. It's kind of revealed to be a kind of a brutal world, which is the material realities of historical realities that have people, and not the imaginal fantasy of the interior world. And the question of it, when we're looking at how our imaginal world is populated, that using these kinds of things like castles and gates and knights and princesses and all this kind of stuff is that the kind of, or to make a pivot to Donna Haraway has this line that to look at what stories we're using to tell our stories, right? And that there's a kind of a multi-Russian doll kind of thing. Like, we're using a story to tell a story to tell a story, and that if we're doing astrology, that if we're using the story that we're always using to tell the story is the story of a king who has a subordinate wife who has an evil whatever, the Saturn's the devil or whatever. I don't know what it would be, right? But the old-fashioned way of looking at whatever the astrological landscape or whatever, that is basically subordinate. But the whole thing is like with Deleuze makes it all about the Oedipus, and we don't have to get into all that kind of stuff. But it does, if you want to push in that direction, then Game of Thrones just incorporates that in, because you have that as the royal family, the structure of the king or whatever is kind of like uses the Oedipal thing to build incestuous power structures that are above the rule of law of the common people or something like that, which you can see in the Lannisters and all this kind of stuff, right? So that side, as I was basically, it's kind of weird to watch Game of Thrones while reading the Anti-Oedipus, but that was part of what the some of the connections I was making, right? Anyways, but continuing. Anyways, he ends up kind of making this thing about the judgments between good and bad, though, and that what is called the unconscious, in a sense, is defined by our ethical judgments. But that in art, in a sense, doesn't have these ethical judgments. And I took a course from J.F. Martel, and he kind of emphasized the basic amorality of art. So this is in line with that. And anyways, I'll just pick up here. Thinking establishes or analyzes connections which in their total configuration constitute a form. The form is coherent and significant, or it is not. In this process, we find the foundation of aesthetics. The aesthetical judgment is opposed to the ethical judgment in that it does not exclude any group of elements, but at most subordinates some to others of greater significance. It is said that the aesthetical process is one of selection, but selection does not mean condemnation of what is not selected. If a painter paints only the outlines of a body with his ink brush, this does not mean that he condemns the elements of flesh, etc. within his outline. It does not pass an ethical judgment against them. He transforms them into implied values. He selects certain factors and stresses certain elements or phases of the total configuration presented by the life experience. For instance, by the scene his eyes behold, but this stressing must be so produced as to give the suggestion of all the elements which have been left obviously unrepresented. In a really great work of art, all elements of a life situation are contained, but some are represented by actual presence, others are implied in the total configuration. Now, the thing about this is if you read, I also have to say, I finished reading Cosmos and Psyche, right? And part of what I'm doing here is there's this basic tension between why something like Deleuze creates a bit of a tension with doing astrological practice is that Deleuze has been basically kind of categorized into a kind of a postmodern force, which the move that Rudhyar is making, doing, there's everything, the aesthetics, the neutral aesthetics of art, goes back to establishing a whole that is kind of like in Zen, where they say there's beads of water on the dewdrops, that each bead of water reflects the whole totality, and that in a work of art, even if you look at like something of the Mona Lisa, even if the Mona Lisa is selecting out one subject, that somehow the Mona Lisa implies the whole totality of the cosmos in one painting, but every painting also implies every other painting, or something like this, right? Like there's something about the Deleuze, in a sense, I was trying to understand Deleuze, he doesn't want to do this because this is creating a tree rather than a rhizome, basically. And Deleuze wants us to think rhizomatically, rather in everything is basically branching out from the same ineffable source or whatever. But you can kind of just still make it work the same way. Like, you can have, like, I like what G.F. Martel kind of approach that I picked up from him is like, there's, just because there are rhizomes exist and rhizoming around doesn't mean there's also trees doing their tree thing. It doesn't necessarily, like, the existence of a rhizome form does not preclude the existence of a tree form, and the existence of a tree form doesn't preclude the existence of a rhizome form, and then whether or not there are things that are somewhat in between, or that if sometimes the tree takes rhizome shapes or the rhizome takes tree shapes. There's nothing in Deleuzian philosophy that says that doesn't work, right? That can't work like that. So in some way, by this is the whole thing about like the binary thinking or whatever, or by looking at something as two wolves, of which wolf are you going to feed, versus seeing a multiple polyvocal, multiplicity of things going on, by reducing it down to either a one thing that you're either affirming or denying, and that creates this thing that is you're either affirming one totalizing structure, or else anything that is outside, that's saying something else, is either affirming that what's already true, or is redundant, basically. But if you keep going that thing, I like what is it, the comic book writer Alan Moore says, that there's, you can meditate on that, but there's not really much, it just turns into this kind of, there's no distinction, there's no variety, there's not, like, you don't get the pantheon of different gods, and they're all on these different independent factors playing off each other in interesting ways. And that's what makes shows like Game of Thrones interesting, is they have all these different factions and rivalries and of course it turns into bloody warfare, but it makes for good television, at least. God damn it. Okay, where are we going to go with this? But that's art, right? That's the whole art thing, is that it's not moral, unfortunately, but at least it makes for good art. But I was going to read something from Cosmos and Psyche about kind of the issue of... it's also kind of funny, some of the... Like, I'll just read this part. From Rick Tarnas. Yet this larger engagement with the cosmos will require of us a profound shift in what we regard as legitimate knowledge. It will demand an initial act of trust in the possible reality of an ensouled cosmos of transformative beauty and purposeful intelligence. Which is what Rudhyar is talking about here, with the inherent aesthetic nature of the universe, which also goes with J.F. Martel, is the transformative beauty and purposeful intelligence, right? It still goes together. But the inner politics of the modern mind, a hermeneutics of suspicion, has completely overpowered and eclipsed a hermeneutics of trust. So the hermeneutics of suspicion goes with the masters of suspicion, right? The Karl Marx and Sigmund Freud and Friedrich Nietzsche. But what's interesting, I find, is that if you could take into consideration when this was written before 2010, and now we're well into the COVID era, and who knows what's around the corner next, kind of thing. It's like the hermeneutics of suspicion is that there's now the common, the salt of the earth, everyday man who is... This whole thing, what I find funny about our cultural moment is that we are, instead of treating the bad guys from Jordan Peterson, the postmodern, neo-Marxists, right, as being the people who have no basic trust in what's going on. It's all about being suspicious of things. Now we have a situation where it's the conservative or the traditional-minded spiritual people who are against postmodernism, because they're against postmodernism, deconstructing the basic whatever, the basic spiritual thing that they've got going on, which is a kind of, in Deleuzian perspective, is a kind of a molar structure, I guess you could say, but a basic foundation of, I don't know, like... But there's some sort of suspicion going on where they're suspicious of all the institutions being like Illuminati or something, or that they're suspicious of the basic scientific technological institution as being something that's going to microchip them or something like that, or like the basic paranoia of our times is a kind of attitude of suspicion. But these are people that would treat Karl Marx as being a bad guy, right? But there are, if anything, the people who are opposed to Marx are the suspicious ones these days, and the people who, if anything, the people, it becomes about whether the statism, though, that's kind of an issue, and maybe there is a valid suspicion of statism, right? And being Marx have been turned into this thing as being something which creates a totalitarian state under communism that people don't like. So it's a complicated issue. Anyways, I'm getting distracted. That was okay. Keep going. The suspicion that has been directed towards nature, towards the universe. But this is the whole thing, the fundamental Gnostic suspicion of nega-Gnosticism. Is it an evil world or something like that? The Illuminati or whatever. The towards other cultures and other worldviews. Other cultures and other worldviews. Also, the Christian things are very hostile towards, paganism or something. But that's been overshadowed now by a whatever, you can do your yoga class and hate gay people or something, or however it works. I don't know. I don't understand. You got all these transphobic yoga people, right? It's a different situation. I should just throw all these inflammatory things there trying to read this. The suspicion has been directed towards nature, towards the universe, towards other cultures and worldviews, towards the spiritual dimension of life, even towards the human being in her embodied and ensouled wholeness. From Bacon and Descartes on, the modern mind directed its suspicion at everything except its own stance of skeptical objectification. The modern blindness to its own purpose was precisely what many postmodern thinkers sought to correct, yet in doing so, the postmodern strategy tended to produce an even more absolute negation, all reality perceived as nothing more than a social linguistic construct. Well, this is the kind of a problem. I don't think that all reality is nothing more than language. I don't think that's necessarily what anybody is saying in postmodernism, but to say that how we form governments is based on a legal process. So if you have laws, and then certain laws dictate what you can do or can't do, let's say when people are upset about COVID stuff, right? Like you're going to put a vaccine in you, which is not a linguistic thing. It's an actual material thing. You're going to have a law to delegate whether or not they do that, and then so these things do actually shape our reality in quite significant ways. But it's not to say that it reduces down to just being a linguistic code and there's nothing material going on. That's not really postmodernism. That's a certain kind of idealism, actually. There's a certain strain of Platonic idealism that goes in that direction, and which is also, if you're doing the Cosmos and Psyche thing, it's kind of confusing because what are you saying exactly? That there's a cosmic mind that that's more fundamental than, there's the cosmic mind that represents the symbolism of the planets moving and the symbolism of our lives is somehow is a kind of a cosmic thought that is like a, what does he say? Like a, all reality perceived is nothing more than a social linguistic construct. But what is an archetype? Is a story, is a myth, is a construct, and then out of these myths and stories, in a kind of a naturalistic way, playing out into phenomena, into the psyche. Isn't it kind of the same thing? That's an interesting point that I don't even know what the answer to that. Well, the idealism. And why you're taking it out in the postmodernists if astrology is fundamentally a kind of a idealistic thing in the first place. It's kind of a funny move to make. Okay, where are we going here? A local projection serving power and enforced by power. And this whole thing where Jordan Peterson often takes issue with the postmodernism by reducing it all to power, that the only thing that's making this kind of thing is power, and which is essentially what Rudhyar is talking about here in terms of I can go back to Rudhyar, bounce back to Rudhyar after this to talk about the power stuff, but that's what I was talking about, the castle, right? The castle and the ego as the kind of the dictator, and that the Jungians treat the unconscious as the dirty peasant people, right? Which is great, because if you watch Twin Peaks, the new Twin Peaks, it's the same thing, because the unconscious is represented as dirty lumberjacks, basically. Like, if you're a rich white guy, the working class are basically the unconscious, because they're the people doing the dirty jobs you don't want to do, so that they get symbolized as these dirty people covered in soot that come out of the mines, and you're like, oh, I don't want to work that, and they're the scary, and they're like, got a light. It's like, oh man, that's Twin Peaks in a nutshell. Where am I going with this? Because the postmodern intellectual milieu uncritically continued the modern assumption of cosmic disenchantment, which is, well, I mean, depends on, I don't know. The major modes of postmodern deconstruction essentially made their valid critical insights the final limit of any metaphysical understanding. So, if you read Deleuze, though, if you read Deleuze, the major modes of modern deconstruction essentially made their valid critical insights. Well, I mean, whether it's kind of debatable whether what Deleuze and Guattari are doing are valid critical insights or not, or whether it's like kind of a schizo creative move or whatever. But they want to make this insight, critical theory, the final limit of any metaphysical understanding. Well, Deleuze doesn't seem to encourage anybody going in that particular kind of direction in it that the Jungians often go in. He's trying to move people in a different direction. But to say that what he's trying to do is to impose a kind of a limit on the on metaphysical understanding is essentially, he's essentially just trying to open up another avenue to explore, which is, if anything, it's limited off by saying everything you do has to, fall back into this established way of doing things, which is a kind of a the conservative attitude. He's essentially saying that by it's not in negate, by creating a fork in the path is basically relativizing the path, right? Relativizing by saying you have to go in this one direction. You can make a fork and say, we're giving you a couple other options to choose. You can fork off this way, or you can fork off that way. It's not necessarily, just because you're forking the path doesn't necessarily mean you're blocking the path, or your intention is to destroy the path completely. You know what I'm saying? Or that people who are into Deleuze can use Deleuze with their spiritual practice in a way that if you wanted to use Deleuze to block off your spiritual path and put your energy into something else, you could do it, but the point is that you're the one who's making these choices, making these assessments, and how are you, what are you affirming and what are you denying, basically, and what are you choosing to accept and reject, and who's calling the shots here, or are you subordinating yourself to some other system that has sorted all that out and advanced for you, right? It's not necessarily negating, the whole point of spirituality, anyways, is that you can't just take it for granted. You have to prove all this stuff for yourself. You can't just there's faith, right? But in some sense, you have to verify everything. You can't just take it on. You have to incorporate it into your own psyche. You have to integrate it, and by doing that as such, you can't just take some sort of dogmatic thing imprinted onto you by society. You actually have to interact with it, and by interacting with it, there is a tension of the opposites of affirming and denying, and whether or not we incorporate that into our system or not, right? And it's not to say that the whole point of that tension, the tension there isn't just to not to do it, it's to work creatively with that, right? Or at least that's how I am doing it. Okay, where are we going with this? But he says, every attempt at larger coherence, every discernment of an underlying spiritual meaning or purpose was fundamentally suspect as nothing more than another totalizing move, another surreptitious attempt to expand the power of one part over the whole. Every imagination of an intelligible whole imbued with a larger significance drew deconstructive forces towards it like heat-seeking missiles. So that's what they're saying. It's a kind of a boohoo, these postmodernists have spoiled our party at creating wholeness, and I am as a young philosopher, am coming back to to look at the scene of the crime and investigate for clues to see if this is really the story that is that they've been selling us, or if there's some other picture that we can make out of this and poor disenchanted universe. Maybe we can do something else with this. Okay, where are we going now? Back to Dane Rudhyar. So the thing about power, right, and the feudal lord. Well, anyways, this is the whole thing about the issue too about what the postmodern relativists, they have this whole thing about like the problem of moral relativism, right? That in some circles moral relativism gets a bad rap, but he's talking. Well, whatever. I'll just jump into Dane Rudhyar here. In reality, in a really great work of art, all elements of life situated are contained, but in some represented by the actual presence, others are implied by the total configuration. This translated in terms of everyday living may be illustrated by the following example. A man determines by ethical judgment or feeling judgment that sexual experiences are bad, and acting upon this judgment castrates himself, like, for instance, origin. This is an extreme case insofar as it involves violent physical action, but in a less accentuated form, all self-compulsive asceticism is of the same type. On the other hand, we may think, this is very Deleuzian Astrology, by the way. On the other hand, we may think of a spiritual person who has reached normally beyond the desire for sex experience. The sex force is active in him but transformed. It is implied but not actually represented. There is no ethical judgment passed against it. But in the ascetical configuration of the whole of his being, sex is suggested but not stressed or even concretely represented. Well, in the self-mutilated man, sex is always present, but in a negative form. So this is like the Freudian repression of the id, right? Where we have a different. The thing is, I don't think the Freudian model is even really relevant anymore, because so much of what the id is, which has had to be this dirty secret, is now people have their OnlyFans page and they're charging money for it. So I don't think it's really I don't think the Freudian model really works anymore. But we can look at this from 90 years ago and see how things have been progressed with the evolution. Anyways, he goes on to say that the moral relativism here. Ethical, and sex is a good example because now we don't see sex as being so evil, right? He says ethical judgments create evil. Aesthetical judgments produce stresses, emphasis, relief, contrast, light and shade, actual and implied representation, climaxes and suggestions. They balance opposites but never condemn absolutely. They harmonize, never discard. They deal with whole relations which they estimate in the totality of their elements. No element can be cancelled without impairing their relation, which is also kind of funny because in context of modern cancel culture, that no element can be cancelled without impairing the relation. In fact, no element in any relation can ever be cancelled. One can only transform it by apparent cancellation into an evil force. So, the things that we cancel become evil because by the sociological act of cancelling them out, designating them as an outsider, as an exile, creates the category of evil or the unconscious, creating the whole thing of like the dirty lumberjack people in Twin Peaks kind of thing, right? Or the woodsman, if you know what I'm saying. Where am I going with this? There's something about the power thing, though. I'm just saying that this whole act, though, of creating a system which judges something to be good, judges something to be evil, which creates divisions, which creates the wall, the castle, where we have peasants that are outside, and we have the noble people that are in the inside, and we have to filter out the dangerous peasants, and the whole structure of the ego and the unconscious. This whole apparatus is a power structure which supports the ego as this thing in power, and subordinates the feminine, which subordinates the working class, which subordinates everything else in the service of the masculine ego as the king and all this kind of stuff. And that is essentially what has people, this tension now between we have the manosphere, we have the traditional male dudes, and then we have the people who everybody just goes trans with automatically. Rather having holding any well, actually I don't know, maybe it's just another expression of the tension or something. I shouldn't make past judgments or anything like this, but it's to me it just seems polarized, that you either go really queer or you really go really go really queer, or you really go really masculine. What can I say? But there's no and you have to define yourself in a way that the system, which is information based, right? The information system can categorize you so it knows what to put on your algorithm. It doesn't want any ambiguity. You're either going to be a masculine guy and you're going to want to drink whatever, the Joe Rogan podcast and be testosteronal, or you're going to be a queer person and you can't, you're going to have to fit into an identity category so that you can be marketed products in a advertising marketing service that you voluntarily sacrifice your data towards, so that they can try to sell you more stuff, which is that's how it works. Where am I going with this? I think that's probably good enough for now. This is at least being able to riff off Dane Rudhyar and riff off Rick Tarnas is that we to at least somehow. One of the problems I have to admit though is that we're leading into a Saturn-Neptune conjunction that's going to last for a while, for the years that Saturn are in Pisces, and then right into the Saturn and Neptune in Aries, which this looks like a kind of a gnarly one, you guys. But one of the things about it, that Saturn-Neptune, is that there's only going to be people who are complete rational skeptics who want to use critical theory and academic, no bullshit philosophy, and are going to see people who woo-woo stuff like me into spirituality and try to drive a kind of a wedge between the critical thinking and what is the intellect, which is essentially just the same move though as what Dane Rudhyar is talking about as this king which wants to be in control and have everything the feminine subordinated to the king, the working class is subordinated to the king, all the things which are threatening to the king's power is subordinated to the king. So there's these people who are apparently the same force who is apparently people so threatening to the masculine power structure of this ego, which is the totalizing force, have just essentially taken it over and then are just inserting different codes into it, right? That are and that's what the tension with the right wing kind of guys are, because the right wing guy, it's kind of like we just want to have movies where guys are like guys in the 80s, and that all the racist, sexist bullshit can still fly, and that we can just live in the same cultural moment, and that we don't have to ever change or something. And it's and maybe this is also why we can't have any new movies, that we just have to have reboots and nobody has any new ideas, and that their culture is at a standstill, and that, and this is one of the things I do like astrology, and astrology is all about going in circles, right? But if you read Cosmos and Psyche, you have to admit that there are leaps and jumps into whatever you call progress. I mean, it's debatable whether progress is even that great. I have to admit, maybe progress isn't, but we're not gonna go back to monkey, are we? Or I don't think so. So there you go. Thanks for listening for the whole 38 minutes. And you can like and subscribe, and at some point in time I may even do astrology readings for people, and I'm even thinking about maybe you could do a Patreon page or something, or I could do if you actually want astrology content, maybe if I got paid. Otherwise I'm making videos like this for a while.